I think we're live. Welcome to Set Impact, where we discuss how emerging technology is changing sectors, society, and the world at large. For a brief period of time, for around about 6 weeks, I'll be speaking to founders solving some of the hardest and most interesting problems over LinkedIn Live at 8 a.m. in the morning. Now, today I'm fortunate enough to have Isabel, the CEO of Immersive Rehab. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
nice to
Could
be
you
on the
tell?
show. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate it. Could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you're doing at Immersive Rehab?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Isabel. I'm the founder of Immersive Rehab. I started the company 4 years ago now, exactly, since 2 days ago. So that was very exciting.
Mm,
And so what we do is we create digital therapeutics, so digital health solutions for people affected by neurological conditions to help with their neurorehabilitation process. And
mm,
so the aim is to help improve neurorehabilitation services for those particular patients, improve access and as well. So because today there's very long waiting times, and so we create these digital therapies within virtual reality to create virtual environments where people can do their rehabilitation exercises in this virtual world. And
yeah, I mean, could you kind of tell the audience the germ of the idea and where the idea originated from?
yeah, absolutely. So the reason why I started the company in the first place is because I had an accident myself, a work accident 10 years ago. So I went through a long rehabilitation period myself that basically left me immobile for a long time. I went through a long rehabilitation period myself, and that came with all the frustrations and isolation that came with it. And I'm a biomedical engineer myself, so I started to just think about how can we change the way rehab is being done, how can we make it more engaging, how can we also improve access to when you're not mobile enough that you can still do it in your home, for example, but also how can we help patients understand better how they're improving from week to week or day to day, where today it's very the assessments are very subjective. So you don't really know what it means to be a 7 on a scale of 10. From one day to the next day, you might be a 5 on a scale
Mm,
to 10. So it's very hard, both for clinicians and patients as well, to then um, exchange patients, for example. So that's really where we want to help as well. Yeah, and that's where the
mm.
idea came from. And yeah, the use of digital technologies obviously offers a lot of opportunities in terms of being able to track data of patients, how they're progressing in their mobility, in their rehabilitation processes, both in the clinic and then in a home setting as well, and send back data. So that really, and the fact of virtual reality, we can create environments that are much more engaging. For example, we can um, the fact that you actually can engage with objects in the virtual world, where in the physical world you're often not able to engage with just such a large object, for example.
Mm.
That is something that obviously motivates then patients as well, because it gives them hope, I guess, and motivation to continue to actually then you do these movements with actual objects and train their mobility going forwards. So.
I mean, could you talk about the technology that you guys have built so far and kind of talk about the use cases you've tested your technology out on currently? Maybe even provide some examples as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have done trials in the UK so far with our programs, and we've mainly worked with hospitals specialized in stroke, spinal injury, and MS.
Mm,
And the results outcomes were very promising in terms of mobility range, increase of mobility range, for example, compared to regular rehabilitation, concentration span and engagement that really increase a lot. Um, there's obviously other aspects that need to further still be investigated in terms of what is the long-term effects, because obviously these patients have only been using it for a shorter amount of time. So what will the effect be on the long term? But yeah, so and we're currently still doing more trials within stroke hospitals, MS, and spinal injury hospitals as well, to test to basically trial it further and validate it further on a clinical level with these patients and their clinicians and therapists. Yeah.
Have you found that the patients that are currently testing your technology in the infancy stage right now, have you found like a better or have you found more enthusiasm to use your technology as opposed to going to normal therapy? I mean, one thing that I'm kind of naive to, because I don't really know anybody that has anybody that has had a
Motor
stroke
neuron
really.
disease,
I
for
mean,
example,
yeah. It must be really difficult to for somebody that lacks the fine motor neuron skills and the motivation and the motivation to pick up a pen. I mean, that's something that we kind of take for granted. But for somebody with for somebody that suffered a stroke, I mean, their motor neuron skills aren't the best. Have you found have you found patients you know have you found the patients more willing to use virtual reality for physical therapy? I mean, in place of physical therapy. I mean, have you found that trend, or do you probably need more data?
I mean, in general, the excitement both from the clinicians and the therapists and their patients have been really great. Nobody has said we don't want to use it, we don't want to try it, and I think it all comes down to having options, because today a lot of the tools that neurologists, therapists have at their disposal is very limited. So they have to help patients within a very limited time. For example, for stroke patients, it's a few weeks, up to 8 weeks in the UK. So, but a lot less in the US. So they have to have this. They have this very limited time to help their patients both walk again and have upper limb motor skills again. And that is, and then they have this very limited. I guess briefcase of tools that they can use to help people improve. And because of that limitation, when they then send people home, and they will send people home after that rehabilitation period, unless they pay further for more treatment, or there's really like a really strong case to say, let's do another session of rehab. They really struggle, because people leave the hospital with still limited mobility. There's for stroke, for example, there's 50% of people that have a remaining disability after they had a stroke, which is massive, and that ranges from kind of minor disability to extreme, really heavy disability. And so it's really offering those patients and those therapists and clinicians a tool to help their patients better and advance more within that time frame that they have while they're in the clinic. And then obviously that they can have a tool to continue their rehabilitation when they're in a home setting, when they don't see the therapist or clinician, and in between sessions, for example, so they can keep improving. And I mean, the best example, and this happened last week. So a contact of mine reached out, and a friend of hers, his daughter, had a stroke at the age of 17. So now she's 18 years old. She went through rehabilitation. She obviously was very motivated to do and to get back to obviously the active person that you are at the age of 17. But today she really still struggles. She's lost all motivation because she doesn't really have access to physiotherapy or neurorehabilitation services anymore. And she's really looking for solutions and tools to help her gain more of her mobility back, as she's still struggling with her upper limb mobility. And that's in a lot of cases the case. So we focus in particular on upper limb mobility, is that the upper limb rehab is often a lot more frustrating and a lot harder for therapists to go through with their patients, and that's often where still a lot of the problems lie when patients leave the hospital. as well. But that's kind of what gives you your independence. If you can use your hands, you can write, you can dress yourself, you can work, you can
Mm.
cook, you can so that's really what then obviously limits a lot of people's independent way of living, and that's what we want to give back, and that's why a lot of people are very open to trying, to coming on board, to testing it. So
That's really interesting. I mean, in the virtual world, when you're picking up an object, I mean, it obviously doesn't weigh anything, but the act of picking up an object, putting it elsewhere, I mean, how does it work on a like? How does it work on a brain level? I mean, so does the does it increase the strength of the neurons? Does it increase a certain part of the brain? Because obviously you're not lifting anything. I mean, even this pen weighs something, but in virtual reality, you're just holding the controllers. Um, is there any research on, you know, certain parts of the brain being strengthened, maybe the neuroplasticity of the brain when they're moving an object from one place to another?
And neuroplasticity obviously plays a big role in everything we do. So it's learning new movements or kind of strengthening a skill that you have in your brain. And the fact of visual representation when you're doing exercise is really important. So visual stimulation of when you're moving your hands, or when you're kind of often exercise like opening doorknobs or something. But when you don't use a doorknob, obviously your brain does not visualize that
Mm-hmm.
doorknob to be opened. And I often compare it with the connection between your brain when you have a stroke is the connection between your brain and your motor skills have been broken because of the damage to your brain. So you kind of have to retrain your brain, rewire it, so actually another part of your brain can take over that
Mm-hmm.
skill. But to do that, you have to do it over. You have to do very repetitive exercises over and over again. But to reinstate, hopefully, a movement that you've lost, and that's where neuroplasticity comes in. So it gives you, by using visual stimulation and visual stimulation using then objects, you can actually do movement and train movement of for example, brushing your teeth. If your brain is damaged and you forgot how to brush your teeth,
Mm-hmm.
then if you would just do this movement, essentially without a toothbrush, your brain wouldn't register the movement with a toothbrush. But in VR, for example, if you do like this with a toothbrush, you can train and train and train until basically your brain gets used to when you pick up a toothbrush, you know what movement you have to do. Because
Mm-hmm.
when we can be basically asleep, we take our toothbrush, we know what movement we have to do. But if
Mm-hmm.
your brain is damaged, obviously you don't know anymore how to do it if that part of your brain is damaged, for example. And so you have to then retrain it using objects. And that's really the power of VR. Obviously, we can, one, use visual stimulation to link certain movements again with or certain interactions again with your brain and your motor skills, and yeah, that is absolutely where neuroplasticity then comes in. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think what I find really fascinating about this on a ground level is being able to do therapy over and over again every day, as opposed to, you know, only when your appointment is set with your specific physician or therapist. I mean, for example, my grandma has issues with her hand, and the she's due to see the therapist over Skype in 6 weeks' time, which is okay. But I mean, I think there's a strong level of accountability through VR. So hopefully, when the prices of the headsets come down and it becomes much more accessible, a therapy like this can be really handy in kind of keeping some level of accountability and speeding up the rehabilitation process. I mean, is there a reason why you're focusing? I mean, it might just be a business use case and the fact that you just have to focus on one thing at a time as a startup. But is there a reason why you're focusing on upper limb rehabilitation as opposed to lower limb rehabilitation? And can you kind of talk about the difficulties and the difficulties in working with both?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. There is definitely a reason why we focused from the start actually on upper limb rehabilitation, is
Mm,
that a lot of the groups that we work with, so neuro people with neurological conditions, they depending on the condition. So every patient's condition is very different. So it's a very different approach to every rehab. Today, obviously, they can't offer every patient a very personalized rehab. But as I said before, so the upper limb rehab is often much more frustrating and hard to go through for patients with their clinician. The problem is the tools that clinicians and therapists have to use with their patients for upper limb rehab is a lot more limited, in terms of the visual simulation, for example. They don't have that. What they have is these wooden cones that they would ask to have patients put in certain holes, which one is very basic, and it doesn't then motivate any patients, because obviously it's a very simple kind of basic childlike game, I guess, where they don't really see the point of doing it as well. And then obviously, because of that frustration, they don't want to do it anymore. They don't see the point of it anymore. They don't see any outcomes. So when they then leave the hospital after a few weeks, or they're at the end of their treatments, they have hardly any gains in upper limb rehab and upper limb motor skills. And because of those upper limb, and so in the contrast for lower limb rehabilitation, there's definitely more tools. Often there's harnesses in a hospital, or they can walk with the patients and holding themselves. So they might have some more tools to actually train upper lower limb. And so that's really where the focus of upper limb comes from. Is to really offer tools to the clinician and the therapist to help their patients recover better, but also because of that independence part. So if you can't use your upper limb, you might be in a wheelchair, as bad as it is. If you can't use your upper limb, you can't really be independent. It takes away so much of your independence, in terms of working, in terms of staying independently in a home, for example, or looking after yourself. And that's really where we want to come in, is really help improve that upper limb. And just an example, I mean, MS, if you look at MS, the average age of MS is 30 years old. It's mainly
Wow.
women, 3-1 women to men. And it's all I mean, that means that all these people that are within their 30s, they are working, or they're caring for someone, or they have other responsibilities. But if you can't use or you're losing your upper limb mobility, that means that obviously you can't work, you can't be independent, you can't look after anyone else, and that really starts limiting your ability then. And that leads to a lot of other problems, which is depression, which is a major issue, because a lot of the patients we've worked with, they had mental health issues, up to very severe depression, which obviously then they already are going through a very hard time because of their brain injury or their neurological situation, condition. And then on top of that, you get a mental health, you're starting to get mental health problems as well, which is very, very hard to go through. So that's really where we want to bring and help people get better, hopefully, using our solutions. So that is really the focus and the aim. It's to really improve the patients' lives, and also to offer clinicians a solution to help improve patients' lives. So yeah, I mean, having been a patient myself, it's the core to everything we do. So that's really the main thing going forward.
I mean, what regulatory frameworks need to be in place in order to make VR and AR a viable and a standard tool for healthcare intervention? And yeah, I mean, where is regulation at in terms of using VR as a healthcare intervention?
Yeah. I mean, so we are a digital software as a medical device. So we are classed
Okay.
as a medical device, our software, because we
Mm.
use it as a treatment, essentially. So that is where the regulations come in from a software perspective. And that comes down to, obviously, we use it with patients that are injured or that have a clinical condition. And that needs to be regulated in terms of, obviously, we collect data, we collect, it also has to be safe and effective for the patient. So that is where one part of the regulations come in. a lot, obviously, yeah, as I mentioned before, data privacy is a really important thing, and that goes for VR in general, whether you work in the healthcare space or not. So because when you use VR for a specific purpose, you're often collecting data from that person that is using the experience as well. So that is a really important issue. And in our case, obviously, it's patient data, so that's really very critical. That said, regulations, they are still very I mean, this and 2 years ago, the regulations were very far behind. So compared to the technology advancements, now they've kind of caught up in a way. At least they've advanced quite significantly in terms of digital health solutions, digital therapies. They've also have certain groups working on immersive technologies, for example, within healthcare. And I'm particularly talking about the FDA, for example, which is very positive, because that means, I mean, they're definitely looking into the different issues that lie within using VR or immersive technologies within healthcare, all the issues that can come with it from a regulatory perspective, and as much of a pain it is to go through regulatory approvals and having to have regulatory certification, it is a necessity. And if you look at a couple of, like, probably 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it was a bit of the Wild West in digital health. People just going into it, not thinking about regulations, and actually putting patients' lives at risk. And I think having as soon as you work with patients, as soon as you have a certain implication on a patient's treatment, it should be a regulated product, because obviously you need to make sure that, like any drug as well, that you don't do any harm to patients. And I think that is what needs to stay laser at center of everything else that companies do, is you cannot do any harm to patients when you bring solutions to the market. So that should be center to any product development that you're doing, anything else. So.
I mean, as a company, where is Immersive Rehab right now, from a company and a product standpoint?
Yeah. So we're still definitely doing R&D, progressing our products. We are still then doing clinical validation studies as well, so clinical trials. Sadly, because of COVID, and that goes for a lot of patients, sadly, as well as that a lot of the centers had closed, because obviously the focus was on COVID-19, and still is in a lot of cases. But they're now restarting their centers. But during this really high period of a lot of infections, a lot of COVID infections, that meant that a lot of the patients actually didn't have access to anything in terms of the clinical access for rehabilitation. So that is something that, yeah, obviously we are working on hard as well. And yeah, hopefully we can really roll it out in Europe, the US, and Canada in the coming year. So that's to kind of continue our trajectory in these regions. So that's the plan. Yeah.
Are you guys beginning to acquire unique data sets on different parts of the brain that are affected when somebody goes through a stroke, or upper limb rehabilitation issues, and also data sets on what parts of the brain need to be strengthened when somebody has a specific issue?
So we haven't really collected any specific. I mean, we're working with a hospital where kind of that is part of a trial that we would be doing. We haven't done any trials yet in the sense that we would really monitor brain activity for a specific condition. So I mean, to be hopefully we can start that trial in the near future, and then this would actually show certain parts of the brain being activated by doing certain motor skill movements, and how this over a certain amount of time would actually impact brain restructuring, for example, for this particular type of neurological condition. But yeah, so far, aside from EEG measurements, we haven't really done any really brain monitoring measurements in terms of trying to understand how this will impact, or how this actually is impacting a brain restructuring within a patient, or how like stroke, for example. Stroke is a lot of stroke patients are at risk of a second stroke.
Mm,
And that is something that we're looking into for the future. I can't really say much about it today, but
mm,
you could imagine that you could potentially flag up a second stroke just by changes in movements.
mm,
But that is something that is very complex and very critical, and that has to be really approached in the most highly scientific manner and clinical manner to make sure that you cannot make any mistakes there, because yeah, it can be detrimental for both the patient and the clinician, and so on as well, if you make any mistakes in
mm,
that. So that is very, very critical R&D and yeah, clinical research that would be, yeah, incredibly fascinating to see how we could actually help on that front as well. Yeah.
mm, mm. I mean, are you guys raising any venture capital money? If so, how much? And what are you hoping it can kind of facilitate and enable you to do?
Yeah, we're currently raising a big seed rounds that will help us grow the team. It will help us continue our product development, in particular from a personalization perspective. It will help also continue our clinical trials that we're doing or planning to do again in Europe and North America. And obviously, yeah, go through all the hoops of regulatory to make sure that we get to we are a fully accepted, a certified solution within North America, for example. So that's
Mm,
really important,
mm,
and that's really why we're fundraising at the moment. So.
mm. I mean, assuming you get funded and you have the resources at hand and the talent at hand, what do you hope to achieve in the next, say, 24 months, assuming you have all the resources and the talent that you need to go forward, and obviously where you're actually able to do clinical trials?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, before I go on, I mean, I'm so grateful to all the clinicians and the patients we've worked with so far in terms of
Mm,
their input, their collaborations, and just their openness in opening hospitals for us, and just their
yeah.
agendas and time slots. So yeah, the next 24 months, if like when we have all the funding in place, then obviously it will be really focused on doing more trials, continuing our development, but just rolling it out to more hospitals, working with even more hospitals, reaching more patients. In the core groups that we work with today, so stroke, spinal injury, MS, and motor neuron disease as well. And yeah, just get it to a stage that we can actually make really significant progress in terms of showing the impact that it makes on patients and the impact that it makes on clinicians and hospitals in general. So that would be the goal for the next 24 months. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing. I really appreciate you jumping on this morning. Is anything else you'd
Sure.
like to shout out before we end this conversation?
I mean, I guess I would say it's been an amazing journey, and we've done so many great things so far. Um, and that's the great thing, is the fact of the journey of getting somewhere as well. So yeah, I would just anybody that's watching that has helped us in some way as well. Thank you so much for for all your support, and yeah, just everyone as well, that it's a very fascinating field that will really grow in the future. And yeah, so I think it will be very interesting to see how things are evolving from both technology perspective and then just implementation perspective in a clinical setting. So that will be really fascinating to see. So,
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for being on the show this morning.
yeah,
Take care.
absolutely. Thank you so much. Bye, chat. Bye.